Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Katie Poser. I'm the Outreach Librarian for the NOAA Central Library, and I will be your host today. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce you to Atlantic Hurricanes and Climate Change by Tom Knutson, who is a senior scientist at NOAA's Geophysical Fluid Dynamics Laboratory. He's a fellow of the American Meteorological Society and the American Geophysical Union, and the former chair of the World Meteorological Organization's expert team on tropical cyclones and climate change. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Tom.
Okay, thank you, Katie. Thanks very much for inviting me to speak today, and thanks everyone for coming. I'm going to talk about Atlantic hurricanes and climate change, and this is a very, I think, a very interesting topic. And I'm going to go the full hour, but if you're in a hurry and can't stay for the whole time, that's fine. The basic message I'll say at the beginning is that it's surprisingly difficult to confidently detect a greenhouse gas-induced signal on Atlantic hurricane activity, though one may be present. And there may be other types of anthropogenic influences coming into play, which I'll talk about during the talk. And secondly, so I'll spend the first half of the talk going through a lot of data, showing lots of different examples about why I make that statement. And then the second part of the talk will be focused on projections of future Atlantic hurricane activity from climate models. And so the big story there, the ones we're most confident in, of course, are sea level rise influence on inundation levels. And then the next most confident would be increases in precipitation rates, and then increases of tropical cyclone intensity. And then we're going down to lower confidence types of projections from there, which I'll go through in the talk. So anyway, I won't be covering all the published literature on here. This is more of a survey of the literature. It's not intended to be the most recent research that we're doing, for example, not focusing on that so much. We'll present some on that at the end, but this is more of an overview of the field. I just want to also point out this web page I have on maintained on global warming and hurricanes. You can get there by just Googling global warming and hurricanes. It's one of the first links that come up, and it has links to other reports, NOAA State of the Science fact sheet on Atlantic hurricanes and climate change, for example, that I was involved in that came out earlier this year, and the WMO assessment, which came out in 2019 and 2020. So I'm going to start by saying what we mean by detection and attribution of climate change. So this is global mean temperature here on the left. The colored curves, except for the orange curve. The orange curve is are models, and the orange shading are the range across different CMIP models, and the other curves are observations. So on the right-hand panel, we have just natural forcings only, and the observations are sort of sticking out of the natural variability envelope of the model. So this is what we mean by detection of a climate change, because the global mean warming we've had is very inconsistent with the what you expect from just natural variability alone, which would be the blue shading here. Also, the warming that we've had is basically relatively consistent with the model's simulation. So it's inconsistent with natural variability alone, but consistent once we add in anthropogenic forcings here on the left, these orange curves. So there's many other lines of evidence to support this, but IPCC basically concludes it's unequivocal that human influence has warmed the atmosphere, ocean, and land. Widespread and rapid changes in the atmosphere, ocean, cryosphere, and biosphere have occurred. So for global mean temperature, there's no question. I think that humans are causing much of this global mean warming that we've seen today. So that's what this is sort of an example. But and also for sea level rise, we also have strong evidence of past increase in sea level rise over the 20th century, and and going back even further, and that human-caused climate change has made a substantial contribution to this global sea level rise. So sea level rise is important because it's sort of it creates the background sea level on which storms sort of ride in on that background level to the coast. When that background level is going up, that can lead to higher inundation levels, even if the storm activity itself doesn't change at all. So that's important to keep in mind. So if you're asked, the answer to the question, have humans affected hurricane activity? Certainly they have through the influence on sea level rise. But what I'm going to focus on mostly today is how about the characteristics of hurricanes themselves beyond the sea level rise influence. So here are some key indices of Atlantic hurricane activity and related indices, all in a sort of stacked plot. The top plot here is global mean temperature that I showed earlier, which has a very clear rising trend since 1880. And we expect that trend to continue from model projections. We're pretty confident, very confident that we're going to continue to have a global mean warming on these multidecadal timescales. Tropical Atlantic sea surface temperature is next, and that also shows warming, just like the global mean, similar overall rate, but with a bit more noise, a bit more multidecadal variability added in. The next curve is hurricane counts in the Atlantic basin, and that actually shows something similar to the tropical Atlantic sea surface temperatures. But let's skip down here to this orange curve, the U.S. landfalling hurricanes for a minute. That actually shows no trend over time, maybe even a slight decreasing trend. So what's going on here? Why are U.S. landfalling hurricanes showing no increase over time, but the hurricane counts over the whole basin showing an increase? And we think part of the explanation here is this middle curve, the red curve, the adjusted hurricane counts. What we've done for this curve is we've taken into account the fact that the observing system has changed very much over time, particularly in the post-1965, because everything prior to 1965 was prior to the satellite era. Once satellites were up over the Atlantic basin, then we could see clearly storms developing and moving over the whole basin. But prior to that, we really depended on just the chance encounters with ships out over the open basin, and we think that there were storms that were missed in the early days in the pre-satellite era. So we tried to account for these, our estimate of missing storms, and that's how we get this red curve with no real trend over time after the adjustment. And it's very similar to the U.S. landfalling hurricanes. Now, this adjustment is not precise, it's just our estimate, but it is somewhat, I think, reassuring that the adjusted hurricane count is similar to the U.S. landfalling hurricane record, which we have much more confidence in than the basin-wide count. So to summarize, I would say there's no clear evidence for detectable, meaning outside natural variability, century scale trend in Atlantic hurricane frequency or U.S. landfalling frequency. We've done some follow-up work on this, and this is work that Gabe Becky led, published in 2021 in Nature Communications. We looked at major hurricanes as well as hurricanes. So major hurricanes are in the right-hand column here and hurricanes the left-hand column. The top row is U.S. landfalling data. So we see that whether we're talking about hurricanes or major hurricanes, there's no real rising trend in numbers of landfalling hurricanes or major hurricanes over time. There was a brief hiatus here in the early 21st century for major hurricanes, landfalling hurricanes. But basin-wide, both of them are showing an increase. But after we do an adjustment based on the ship track density and adjusting in the pre-satellite, pre-1965 era, the adjustment is this red curve. So we're adding in this sort of estimated number of missing storms. After we add that in, we get no trend over time in the basin-wide count. Now, notice that there is this rising trend since 1980 in basin-wide major hurricanes. I'll come back to that throughout the talk. So, sure, there is definitely an increase since 1980, but the increase since 1980, if you draw a trend through that, is not really representative of the long-term trend. So there's really no long-term trend showing up in these indices. It's just the trend since 1980. Instead, we have sort of substantial multidecadal variability going on in the major hurricane counts and hurricane counts. Also, if we look at the fraction of hurricanes that reach Category 3 intensity over time, so this is not the number, but the fraction. And in that case, again, we have an increase in the fraction reaching Category 3 over time since 1980. But going back in the record, then we have no real trend over time, whether we use, particularly using the adjusted data here with the blue curve. No trend over time. So this is interesting because this is sort of related to intensity. If intensities are really increasing a lot, we would expect this ratio to be increasing over time. And it is since 1980, but not over the 20th century as a whole. So that is suggesting to us maybe there's not that much strong evidence for increasing intensity in the Atlantic Basin, at least so far, based on on these records. There are other types of century scale records of tropical cyclone activity, both in the Atlantic Basin and elsewhere. This top one here is severe landfalling tropical cyclones in eastern Australia. No real trend, maybe perhaps a downward trend over time. I think that there has been some assessment that this may be statistically significant, but we have some concerns about internal multidecadal variability. Tropical cyclone landfalls in Japan, relatively flat. Hurricane landfalls in the US, I showed earlier, relatively flat. This fourth index here is based on surge events. So this is measuring how much, measuring the number of large US storm surge events from tide gauge data. So it only depends on tide gauge data, not anything else. And this is some work by Grinstead et al. That they inferred that there was some global warming signal in this, although it is sort of marginal, especially with this high activity occurring in the 1930s as well. So there's some debate about whether there's really a global warming signal in that or not. Tropical cyclone Atlantic Basin Power Dissipation Index has been increasing since the 1960s, as PDI, but again, we have some question about in the pre-satellite era whether they're missing storms or not, which would not be included in this bottom analysis here. So anyway, the short answer here is we don't really see a lot of strong evidence for increasing long-term century scale increases that we might expect if greenhouse warming were having a big impact on these types of measures. This is the US landfalling PDI. This is some unpublished work, but it's, again, power dissipation index depends on the cube of the wind speeds and the number of storms. So if you look at that for US landfalling, no trend over time, but it does seem to be, there seem to be some large fluctuations here in the latter part of the time series. So this brown curve here is showing the 20-year running standard deviation. So maybe there's more variability going on in the latter part of the record. It was maybe there was less variability in the mid part and then somewhat higher in the earlier part. A NOAA colleague, Josme Lopez, gave it a nice talk a couple days ago looking at possible changes in the variance of some tropical cyclone measures. So I just put this in after his talk, this 20-year running mean result. We can even go back further than 1900, looking at landfalling activity. One study used a variety of document-based sources like newspaper reports and put together a 318-year record of tropical cyclones in the Lesser Antilles here, this little red box region. And they were finding, even if you count storms that way, you have hurricanes in the top, tropical cyclones, or tropical cyclones and hurricanes combined, there was no clear century scale trend in these indices either, based on these sort of documentary based 300-year plus record. So, Jim Cosson, formerly at NOAA, but while he was at NOAA, he did this study showing a slowdown in propagation speeds of tropical cyclones over U.S. land since 1900. He found a 14% slowdown in the median of their speeds, a 24% slowdown in the 10th percentile, and so forth. So this could be important because if the storm is moving more slowly, then it can drop greater amounts of rain in any particular location. So it is important to also to monitor how fast the storms are moving. It does seem that they're slowing down, but we don't really know why they're slowing down yet. I was involved in a study where we tried to actually simulate historical changes in tropical cyclone propagation speeds led by Ganzong. We didn't find evidence for this decrease, a significant decrease over U.S. land. We did see we project some decreases in storm propagation speed, especially out over the open North Atlantic, sort of east of New York City and so forth, but not in the historical record, so not in historical time period. So we're really not clear. It's not clear why this is happening yet. It's something we're keeping an eye on because it could be important, but we can't yet explain it. Looking at multidecadal variability now, I want to say a little bit more about that. So these plots have gray shading on them. That's the smooth version of Atlantic major hurricane numbers basin-wide. It hasn't been adjusted for any missing storms or anything like that, but it does show this pronounced multidecadal variability, no real trend, but there's a trend since 1980, but not over the whole record. The multidecadal variability features this very active period since the mid-1990s and relatively inactive period, which is sometimes referred to as a hurricane drought or major hurricane drought in the 1970s and 1980s, and then another higher period back in the 1940s, 50s, 60s. So that's what we mean by multidecadal variability in major hurricane activity. And I show some other indices here, which are very strongly correlated, at least, to major hurricane activity. We have a shear index, which is the red curve. So that's the inverted shear index, and that's saying that in periods where hurricane activity is high, shear over the main development region, wind shear is sort of the change in wind speed and direction with height. And here we're measuring it over the main development region in the tropical Atlantic. So when you have a lot of major hurricanes in the Atlantic, that's when shear is low. When wind shear is high, that's when you have relatively low numbers of major hurricanes in the Atlantic basin. So pretty good correlation. The other indices we're showing here, the blue one is the AMOC fingerprint. The blue dash is Atlantic Multidecadal Variability Index, so that's basically over the whole North Atlantic, the sea surface temperature index. The AMOC fingerprint is actually, this is some work by Rong Zhang, my colleague at GFDL, and what Rong has done is try to infer AMOC. AMOC is the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation, which is a measure of overturning circulation in the ocean. And what Rong has found is a sort of a substitute fingerprint for this AMOC based on subsurface ocean temperature in the North Atlantic. And based on that AMOC fingerprint, that also seems to be very correlated with wind shear and with major hurricane activity. And that Atlantic meridional overturning circulation, you see it has also high phase, low phase, high phase. We think that's largely due to internal variability of the ocean circulation. So we think, therefore, that it's quite possible that internal variability of the Atlantic Ocean overturning circulation is one of the drivers for this multidecadal variability in Atlantic hurricane activity. But also, there may be other factors too. I'll get to one, aerosols now. So this is another of my colleagues at GFDL, Hiro Murakami, led a study looking at linear trends in the frequency of tropical cyclones. I did a map of that globally from 1980 to 2018. So a relatively short period, again, just since 1980. And that shows an increase over the Atlantic basin, decreases. These blue areas are where tropical cyclones have been decreasing. but basically shows a strong, relatively strong observed increase since 1980 over the Atlantic basin. No surprise there. As I mentioned earlier, a lot of these indices are showing increases since 1980 over the Atlantic basin. Now, here was an interesting point of the study that, in addition to this observed map, the simulated trend in the model. So when they put in the best estimate of historical climate forcing agents over time, the model simulates a decrease. Simulates an increase over the Atlantic basin and much of the Northwest Pacific, and decreases over much of the rest of the globe. Now, there's a fair amount, I think, a broad similarity between this pattern simulated by the model and the observation. So that's giving us some confidence, I think, that the model is doing a reasonably good job of simulating many aspects of this observed trend pattern. Now let's focus in on the Atlantic basin in particular and take a look at the time series from this model. So these are time series global and Atlantic, but I just want to focus on the Atlantic basin. So the black curve here are observed tropical cyclones frequency year by year in the Atlantic since 1980. And you see this increase shown here. The red curve is the model simulation when we put in all the forcings and run the model over this same time period. So notice that there's this general decline in the model, especially in over the 21st century. That's being driven, that's basically the model's greenhouse gas dominated signal. So this model simulates a decrease in frequency over the Atlantic with increasing greenhouse gases. But you notice there, the model kind of goes through this period here from about 1980 to the present, where the red curve is actually sloping up. It's capturing part of this trend. So why did this model go through this, instead of just monotonically decreasing, why did it have this period of increase? And that is due in large part to the temporal behavior of aerosol forcing in the model. So from 1980 forward, we had a decrease in aerosol burden in the atmosphere over the Atlantic basin, which apparently in the model leads to some temporary warming in the Atlantic basin, and also to sort of a temporary increase in tropical cyclone frequency, which explains or describes some of this observed increase, though the observed increase is a bit larger than what's simulated in the model. So what we have here is, in some sense, is a detection of an anthropogenic increase, anthropogenically driven increase in Atlantic hurricane activity, but it's just temporary. It's based on the behavior of aerosols. And once we get to the more greenhouse, so once we get into the 21st century with this model, where it's basically just greenhouse warming and not so much change in aerosols anymore, that's where we see the model's sort of true greenhouse response. So yes, there does seem to be some anthropogenically driven increase in tropical cyclone frequency in the Atlantic, but it seems to be, in this model at least, a temporary increase due to reduction of aerosols. So now we have these two different processes, aerosols and also perhaps natural variability, the AMOC that I mentioned earlier. Both may be contributing to this increase in the Atlantic basin hurricane. So how much is each one contributing? We're not sure, because both of these things have quite a bit of uncertainty in them. The aerosol responses in models has quite a bit of uncertainty. So it's still a case where we're trying to understand the relative contributions, at least for tropical cyclone frequency, of the aerosol decrease since 1980 and of the natural variability, things like AMOC. But it doesn't, at least from this model's perspective, greenhouse warming is not really contributing to the increase, unless the model is completely wrong about the sign of the change, which could be. Okay, so other factors which have changed in the Atlantic, other measures which have changed in the Atlantic since 1980, intensities have gone up. Here's this top middle row. So more than in any other basin. It's gone up a little bit globally. There is a significant trend globally, but a really strong trend in the Atlantic. But again, we're not, the Atlantic is one with this strong multidecadal variability since 1980. We really don't know what to make of this trend, I think, yet, of intensity. It could be driven by partly by the aerosol decreases and the natural variability. And it could also be driven in part by greenhouse warming. We still are not sure how to sort of divide up this increase of intensity across different possible forcing factors. A former colleague of mine, Kieran Bhatia, led a study, which I was co-author on rapid intensification since 1982. We found here this time series of the fraction of cases undergoing rapid intensification, greater than 30 knot increase in 24 hours. That's been trending up in the Atlantic and globally. This plot on the left here is showing the case for the Atlantic. What we did in this study, which is rather unusual, I think, we compared this trend in observations to the trend you get in the model, to the distribution of trends you get in our climate model when we just let natural variability alone operate. So we just have some AMOC type of fluctuations, of some type of Atlantic multidecadal variability going on in the model, and we take the model's estimate. We assume for the moment that the model estimate is truth, and then you compare the observed trend to this model estimate. So the model estimate is shown by this sort of bar and whisker diagram with the mean here, but these whiskers here are about the 98th percentile or so. So basically and this blue and green line here, that's the observed trend. So we're basically saying that this observed positive trend is right at the edge of what this model can simulate from just natural variability. So that may mean that there's a emerging signal outside of natural variability. Of course, this depends on how much we believe the model's simulation of natural variability, because this is just a single model we're showing here. And so our conclusions about whether this is a detectable signal or not are dependent really on how much we believe the single model estimate of natural variability. But anyway, there is definitely has been an increase in rapid intensification since 1982. Whether it's emerging from the noise of natural variability, it seems to be near the edge according to one model, and also the change that we're seeing is in the direction that we expect from greenhouse warming, and that's shown by this map from the same paper, the series of maps showing where we did a model simulation under 1940 conditions, 1990 conditions, and 2015 conditions. And you see going from 1940 conditions to 2015 conditions, the map gets redder and redder. Redder means more rapid intensification cases. So what's going on in this model is we're finding this increase in rapid intensification as we go from 1940 to 2015 conditions. So it's in the same direction as we were seeing in the Atlantic and globally for that matter, for rapid intensification. So that's giving us some indication that what we're seeing may be an emerging anthropogenically forced signal in rapid intensification. But again, based on a single model, so we have to be a little bit cautious about how much confidence to put in that. I don't want to leave Hawaii out of this talk completely. So my colleague Hiro Murakami several years ago did look at hurricane activities near Hawaii. He looked at the number of cases when you had a tropical cyclone approaching close to Hawaii, and he actually has a time series of that since 1950 here. And first, we see there's really no long-term trend in that. It's been sort of fluctuating around. He did use a climate model to try to assess how we expect this probability of tropical cyclones near Hawaii, how we expect it would have changed over time. So he has an 1860 type pre-industrial type simulation. That's the red bar, and this is the probability of either 1, 2, or 3 tropical cyclones being near Hawaii in a given year. So the red curve is the sort of pre-industrial simulation, and the green curve is the 1990 conditions, and the blue curve is the observation. And you see that going from the red to the green, there's this increase. So that's saying that the model thinks there should have been an increase in the number occurring near Hawaii. So that suggests that maybe there is an anthropogenic effect. Maybe tropical cyclones are getting more frequent near Hawaii. But we have to be a little cautious here because in this case, we're making an attribution statement based on these modeling results, but without detection. I mean, what do I mean without detection? I mean that if you just look at the time series of TC frequency near Hawaii, it's basically flat. So we're not really seeing a rising trend like we saw back for, say, for global mean temperature. So this is an example of attribution without detection. So we have somewhat less confidence in that type of attribution. Now, how about precipitation? So IPCC AR6 concluded that frequency and intensity of heavy precipitation events in general has increased since the 1950s over most land areas that have sufficient observational data. So these blue areas are where there's over the US and Canada and Mexico, where we're seeing an increase in extreme precipitation. And red areas where we have a significant decrease. So there are some red areas with decrease. There are a lot of open circle areas with no significant change. But the biggest signal we see here is a preponderance of blue dots. So there's this substantial signal then in increasing significant trends in extreme precipitation in general. This is what it looks like globally. Now, IPCC, when they were talking about tropical cyclone precipitation, they said that event attribution studies and physical understanding indicate that human-induced climate change increases heavy precipitation associated with tropical cyclone. They have high confidence in that, but data limitations inhibit clear detection of past trends on a global scale. So what they're saying there is we don't yet have like time series of tropical cyclone rainfall that show rising trends, clear, significant rising trends over time. But we have other methods of trying to assess it. So what do they mean by these event attribution studies? Well, there's studies that did statistical modeling and some dynamical modeling of extreme precipitation in eastern Texas, and compared that to and put that to use that to assess Hurricane Harvey, which I'll talk about in a moment. You can also use these idealized model simulations where you take some storm like Katrina and then resimulate it and assume it would have occurred in some future warm climate, and then simulate Hurricane Katrina with the warmer sea surface temperatures due to anthropogenic warming, and you get typically some increase in rainfall rates in those simulations. But those are examples of event attribution studies. Again, no detection, so it's attribution without detection in some sense. Okay, Hurricane Harvey, big multi-day rainfall producer over East Texas. Lots of flooding problems. Here we're looking at maps of observed maximum 3-day average rainfall associated with Hurricane Harvey. A number of attribution studies looked at whether anthropogenic forcing contributed to Hurricane Harvey. Here's one that's looked at these 85 stations here and looked at the extreme 3-day rainfall as a function of global mean temperature. So it's kind of like a function of time because global mean temperature has been increasing. Anyway, so for higher global mean temperature values, you have higher extreme values of extreme 3-day rainfall over these 85 stations. And this green box here at the top was the Hurricane Harvey event. So it's really a big outlier. Then they did some extreme value fitting, generalized extreme value fitting of the data, and did a time-dependent fits and found that the fit for 1990 type condition years had lower extreme rainfall values in the data than for 2017. The 1900 is in blue, 2017 in red, so indicating the data showing an increase in extreme precipitation in general since 1880. Not just tropical cyclones, but in general. So, and they also, I won't go into detail here, but models, they also use models, 2 different models to try to simulate how extreme rainfall, 3-day rainfall would be expected to change in eastern Texas. So again, this is not just hurricanes here, this is all types of extreme rainfall, and those are, we're also showing an increase due to global warming. They concluded that global warming made extreme precipitation 8 to 19% more intense, and made some precipitation, extreme precipitation like Hurricane Harvey's, perhaps 1.5 to even 5 times more likely. So This is an example of using a variety of methods to try to assess whether global warming played a role in Hurricane Harvey's precipitation. So we don't have a time series of hurricane rainfall, but these are using extreme rainfall in general over eastern Texas and showing some evidence both from the data and from models for increase over time on the century time scale. Well, again, on the topic of tropical cyclone precipitation, there have been a few other studies of note. Keeling's and Ayala's 2019 study looking at extreme tropical cyclone only rainfall, 129 storms from 1956 on over Puerto Rico. 9 of the 17 stations in a small region of Puerto Rico showed a significant influence of long-term climate change. They did some statistical modeling to try to assess that. But they had the limited ability to reach definitive conclusion on the relationship of, say, Hurricane Maria's precipitation to climate variability and change due to, again, to just inherent stochastic nature of rainfall in Puerto Rico. So in some cases, for some of these stations, they did find the probability of a rain event of Maria's magnitude had likely increased by a factor larger than 1, with a best estimate of a factor of nearly 5. But they had there were a lot of caveats they still had in their study. There was a paleo study looking at tree ring-based tropical cyclone precipitation over North and South Carolina, Maxwell et al., who were finding a recent increase in the last 60 years in the tree ring-based record, which they linked to increasing tropical cyclone duration and slowing propagation speeds. So these are some other studies out there looking at tropical cyclone rainfall. Other studies looking at major hurricane intensities. This is the proportion of hurricanes that observations that are at category 3 or higher. This is some work again by Jim Cosson, who shared this slide with me. So globally, there's an increase in the proportion of hurricane fixes, if you will, that are, or hurricane observations that are at category 3 or higher. It's been increasing since 1980. So his satellite-based data only goes back to about 1980. It's a huge increase in the North Atlantic. If he takes out the Atlantic data, still has some increase. It's not as strong as in the original global record, but it still has an increase. IPCC concluded that there's medium confidence that this increase globally is outside the range of natural variability. So could be. On the other hand, we haven't really done clear studies to simulate how much we expect over the same time period with climate models, so it's difficult to make an attribution statement to anthropogenic forcing, but at least there does seem to be some change in this particular metric. But remember, I showed earlier that the proportion of category 3 and higher hurricanes, well, not hurricane fixes, so it's a slightly different metric, but the proportion of Atlantic hurricanes that were category 3 or higher at their maximum intensity, but that's been increasing since 1980. We found that, but that was not actually showing up in the longer term data. So that's one reason why I think that Jim took out the Atlantic data to take a look at the global without that complication of that multidecadal variability in the Atlantic. And this is just a quick plot showing that maybe we may not have expected intensities of tropical cyclones to have increased very much in the Northern Hemisphere. This is based on a theoretical model of maximum tropical cyclone intensity when you look at historical climate model runs. The black curve are the historical runs. The red curves show an increase. Those are greenhouse gas forced runs. So greenhouse gases has been increasing potential intensity of tropical cyclones over time, according to this model calculation. But aerosols have been producing a counteracting decrease, so that the net aerosols and anthropogenic forcing together gives you the black curve, which hasn't shown very much because of this offsetting influence of aerosols. So maybe things will be different going into the future, but at least this is one reason why it may be difficult to detect so far an increase in hurricane intensities. These are some global records of tropical cyclone frequency. global, not just Atlantic, no trend over time in tropical cyclones or hurricane force tropical cyclones using data since 1970. That's about as far as we can go back on that one. And then for landfalling tropical cyclones globally, again, no real trend evident in the category 1 and 2 storms. Category 3, 4, and 5 has some sort of slight rising trend. It's kind of on the edge of statistical significance, but there were some questions about the reliability of the data in the earlier part. So they made no strong claim about detecting a trend at this point. And then that the Northwest Pacific, there does seem to be a poleward shift in the latitude of maximum intensity, which I won't go into here. So what I've been talking about was past data. Now let's shift gears and look at model projections. So what do climate models say, apart from past data, about changes in track, intensity, size, frequency, precipitation, season length, and so forth? There are a lot of different metrics we can look at. Here's some earlier work that I led on looking at global changes in frequency of tropical cyclones. That's this bottom figure here. The green is where we project over the 21st century a decrease in tropical cyclones. So that's most of the tropics, but an increase here in the Eastern Pacific near Hawaii, for example. So our projection from this study was 16% reduction in tropical storm frequency, but if we restrict it to category 4 and 5, category 4 or 5 days, instead of all tropical cyclones, now we have increases over much of the globe. So we're getting we got a different projection for category 4 or 5 than we did for tropical cyclones in general. And we think that's because we have a shift in the model toward higher intensities, so a greater fraction of storms is reaching category 4 or 5 intensity. So even though the total number of storms is decreasing, the fraction of them of category 4 or 5 increasing, we actually get an increase in category 4 or 5 days. That's this one study. We've looked at many studies now. We did a sort of study looking at across different studies. This WMO task team or expert team that published our results in the bulletin, the AMS. So these are the summary of results across existing published studies that we assessed. We looked at 4 metrics: tropical cyclone frequency. Now this is for the Atlantic basin alone here. Tropical cyclone frequency, Cat 4 or 5 frequency, intensity, which is wind speed, and rainfall rates. Now the dark blue is the mean result from the models, and the shading is the 5th to 95th percentile type range across the modeling studies. So we see that the clearest thing is the rainfall rate increase. That's very robust across all the studies we assessed. It's about 15% increase on average. There's also pretty strong evidence for an increase of intensity, although the bottom end of this extends down close to 0. But over the Atlantic is about a 3% increase. So not as large an increase for intensity as for rainfall rates. For category 4 or 5 frequency, the studies show on average an increase, but a rather large range across studies. So not a real consensus. And for tropical cyclone frequency, the majority of studies show, and this is, I believe, actually median, the majority of studies show a decrease of overall tropical cyclone frequency, but again, some models showing an increase. So this is to say that when you look across studies, there's most consistency for rain rate, pretty good consistency for intensity, but mixed results across studies for frequency, at least in the Atlantic. And I think the same general types of results are found in other basins and globally, which I'm not really going to go into here. These are changes for a 2°C global warming scenario, for example. Okay, so again, when we looked at category 4 or 5 frequency, here in the upper left is the global percent change in frequency globally, and the dash, this is a histogram. So the dash blue is showing the results for low resolution models, and the red is showing the results for high resolution models. So they're kind of split. The higher resolution models are tending to show most high resolution models showing an increase. Most low resolution models showing a decrease. If you look at the proportion of storms that reach category 4 or 5, then there's much more agreement, almost all the models showing an increase. So for that, then we have medium to high confidence that there will be an increase in the proportion of tropical cyclones that reach category 4 or 5 frequency, but not in the number, because we have this proportion change, but that's going in one direction, but the overall number of storms is decreasing. So those two things are sort of competing against each other. This is looking at the rainfall rates in the North Atlantic that I mentioned. This is just showing how that change varies with the radius from the storm, and also how it compares to just what we'd expect from a Clausius-Clapeyron type relation of how tropical water vapor in the atmosphere increases with warming. It goes up at something like 7% per degree Celsius, and that's a pretty good description of what happens, at least in this model, in terms of rainfall rate. So you have more water vapor in the atmosphere, the hurricanes converge this larger amount of water vapor in towards storm and create higher rainfall rates. Category 4 or 5 frequency in the Atlantic. This is an earlier study that we had done showing present day simulation of 14 storms over a 27-year period at category 4 or 5 frequency. And then for these other 3 boxes are future climate simulations showing 20, 28, 19 storms, all of them showing increases in category 4 or 5 frequency. The most recent work that we did looked at U.S. landfall in category 4 or 5 frequency, again, in the Atlantic Basin, again, looking at 27 seasons. The observation from 1980 to 2006, we had 3 such storms and observations. And our present day simulation, we had 1, but you see in our climate warming simulation, we had 4, 2, and 9. So increases in the warmer climate simulations, and these are usually looking at 10 different CMIP3 individual models, almost all of them showing increases. A few have 1 storm showing no increase, but most of the models showing an increase. So these are some summary results from the study showing basin-wide hurricane counts were reduced, but category 4 or 5 hurricane counts basin-wide were not changed. U.S. landfalling hurricane counts had little change overall, but increased for category 4 or 5. So what's going on here? There seems to be an increasing proportion of hurricanes and category 4 or 5 hurricanes that make U.S. landfall in the future. That's how you can get these different results for basin-wide versus U.S. landfalling. So why would that be? Why would we have this increase in fraction of storms making landfall? So these are for different model simulations. The red are showing where there's an increase in occurrence of tropical cyclones, and blue where there's a decrease in occurrence. So you see these red areas seem to be more focused over near the U.S. So there seems to be a shift in tropical cyclone activity toward the U.S. These are the genesis, where genesis location is occurring. That could explain part of it, but we think much of it is explainable from changes in the wind speeds. So with global warming, we tend to have these arrows are the 200 to 500 millibar average winds. So we take that as an approximation of steering flow for tropical cyclones. Those are pointed back toward the U.S. We think that in the model, that's a change in the environment, which is sort of discouraging or interfering a little bit with this recurvature of tropical cyclones into the westerlies, because we're reducing the westerlies. We think that's why we're getting, one reason why we're getting the greater fraction of storms and category 4 or 5 storms in our simulation making landfall. So this is a relatively recent result, and again, it's just a one modeling study, and it does vary a little bit according to which model we downscale. So we're a little bit cautious. We don't want to we wouldn't be very highly confident in these results. So this is just a summary of that study where we found this robust large-scale circulation change favoring the track shift toward the U.S. There's also some shifting of the genesis toward the U.S. So we have a greater proportion of tropical cyclones over the Atlantic making U.S. landfall. So even though we have reduced frequency overall and no change in category 4 or 5 overall, the whole basin, we still get an increase in U.S. landfall in category 4 or 5 because of this proportion, this changing of the steering flow and so forth. And we also found increasing precipitation rates. There are some problems that still worry us. For example, as Richard Seeger has pointed out, climate models have a very difficult time simulating tropical Pacific SST trends, and these can have some impact on Atlantic hurricane activity. So this is something we have to worry about with models. We have to figure out why models have struggled to reproduce historical observations. It's still an open question, but that could have some impact on projections and our confidence in projections. So I have two more slides. They just recap the observations, and the last one will recap the projections for the future. So recap from observations: no increase in U.S. since 1901, no increase in U.S. landfalling hurricanes or major hurricanes, even though there's been attributable anthropogenic warming of sea surface temperatures in the tropical Atlantic. Human influence likely contributed to multi-day precipitation extremes in eastern Texas. Hurricane Harvey rains were the most extreme observation. Of course, Hurricane Harvey, one thing that led to its precipitation being so extreme was that it stalled out over eastern Texas, and that's one reason why it's a little bit difficult to make attribution statements about Hurricane Harvey and anthropogenic warming because of the stall out influence. Sea level rise does exacerbate coastal flood risk, and human influence very likely the main driver of sea level rise since the 70s. And there's been a slowing of tropical cyclone propagation speeds, but the cause of that's unknown. Since the 1950s, I have showed these multidecadal variations of, for example, major hurricane counts, vertical wind shear, and the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation. What's the cause of this? Changes in aerosol forcing, internal climate variability, or proposed mechanisms. We're not sure what the relative contributions are, but no long-term trend is apparent since 1950. So not much clear evidence for a greenhouse gas-induced signal, at least since 1950. Since 1980, all sorts of things have been increasing over the Atlantic basin, but I showed that one has to be very careful not to assume that a trend since 1980 is representative of a longer-term trend. And so we're still in the process of figuring out why these various metrics have increased since 1980, including rapid intensification, intensities, proportion of category 3-5 storms, and so forth. How much of it's internal variability? How much is it aerosol reduction? And is there also a greenhouse gas warming induced component? Now, the answer to this has important implications for the coming decades because we don't expect aerosol reduction to provide any further increase. If it's internal variability, things may slow down, activity may slow down in the coming decades. If there's a greenhouse gas induced component, we would expect that to increase in coming decades. So it's really critical to understand what the relative contributions of these different factors are to these changes we've been seeing since 1980. And the last slide I'll just leave up is just a summary of future Atlantic hurricane projections. Storm surge, inundation levels, we think we're going to get worse because of sea level rise. Precipitation rates, we have tropical cyclone precipitation rates, we have medium to high confidence for an increase in those. For tropical cyclone intensity, medium confidence for an increase in the Atlantic basin. So about a 3% was our average range that we got for a true degree warming. Proportion of tropical cyclones that reach category 4 or 5 levels, we have medium confidence in an increase. However, for the number of tropical cyclones reaching category 4 or 5, we have mixed results, so we don't have as high confidence. As I'm going down here, I'm going toward lower confidence conclusions. So not so much confidence in the total number of category 4 or 5 storms and whether those will increase or not. And tropical cyclone frequency of all tropical storms and hurricanes, mixed results across models. most models actually showing a decrease, but there's some models showing an increase. So I'll just stop there and end it with that slide and take some questions.
Thank you so much, Tom. This was very educational, and I hope we've got a few questions. I do have one teed up right now. The first question is, has there been any trends on tropical cyclones reaching mid-latitudes more often or increasing intensity once in mid-latitudes?
I'm not aware. Well, so we do have the results from Jim Cosson showing that the storms are reaching their maximum intensity at systematically higher latitudes. So this is just tracking at what latitude does a tropical cyclone reach its maximum intensity. That seems to have been shifting poleward in both hemispheres, but interestingly, we don't see that poleward shift in the Atlantic basin. I had to kind of run through that part very quickly. The trend is that change is most apparent in the Northwest Pacific basin, where it does seem to be a trend which is getting outside of what we'd expect from natural variability. So it's another one where there may be an anthropogenic trend emerging, especially in the Northwest Pacific basin. But in the Atlantic basin, we're not seeing a similar kind of trend. There are some studies out of some of my colleagues at Princeton University have been looking at extratropical transition and how those extratropically transitioning tropical cyclones are expected to change in the future. In their future projection, they were projecting more of those extratropically transitioned tropical cyclones to occur in the northeastern U.S. and regions like that. But again, that's a future projection and is not one that, to my knowledge, is yet a case where we're seeing a detectable change in the observations. So that's been one of the themes of what I've been showing here, is that when we just have a change just that we project from a climate model, it's hard to go to high confidence in that kind of change for the future when we don't yet see a detectable change in observations. So that's the linkage between the two parts of my talk. When you have a detectable change in observations, it gives you more confidence in such a change continuing in a future projection.
Thanks, Tom. We have a question talking about confidence. What do you see as the key direction for research to improve confidence of tropical cyclone future projections?
I think we can go in several directions. We want to continue to improve our models. We want to continue to interrogate past data, try to even reconstruct more past data so we have even more data to inform us about whether there have been trends or not. As each decade goes along, we're going to have more data going into the future. So our data set's going to build up naturally over time. I do think it's important for us, especially in a case like hurricanes and climate change, to confront our models with observations, to see where our models are being consistent or not with observations when they're run with historical forcings. So I think that's an area that can use more work, sort of along the lines of what Hiro Murakami has been doing. So, and I think our models will get better over time as we go to higher resolution. We have greater computer power. We can begin to simulate storms with higher resolution, which allows us to simulate higher intensity storms, more realistic hurricane structure, and perhaps even a more realistic climate change background signal that's going to drive future changes. So it's going to be a combination of things, bringing together observations, improving observations, increasing observations, improving models, and bringing them together in a sort of coherent picture that I think ultimately will lead to higher confidence on this particular problem. It's one where we've already gone a long way down that path for, say, global mean temperature, where we have this huge emerging trend, and models do a rather good job of simulating it, even though we still have debates in the climate science about exactly what the climate sensitivity is, whether the high sensitivity models are reasonable or not. So there's still work to be done there, but I think we have even more to do. We're in a more uncertain stage when we're talking about something like Atlantic hurricane activity, partly because we don't have these very strong time series showing these strong emerging trends like we do for something like global mean temperature or sea level rise.
Thanks, Tom. We are a little over time, but I do have one more question that I think we should answer before we go. So our attendee asks, can you elaborate more on how you adjusted the number of hurricanes over the Atlantic basin, especially before the satellite era?
Yeah, so before the satellite era, we had no satellites, then you were dependent on other types of things to measure, to tell you whether there was a storm out in the open Atlantic. These days, we just look at a satellite and we can say, oh, yes, there's a storm, maybe a hurricane out in the central Atlantic. But prior to the satellites, how did you know if there was a storm out there? So, well, if the storm had encountered a ship, just serendipitously, a ship had run into the storm and the ship recorded the winds, then you would have some kind of record of the storm and also its maximum wind speed. Or if the storm ran over ran over an island or something like that. So we're not really concerned in the pre-satellite era about landfalling storms, because then we had a pretty good idea of how many there were and even how strong they were. But it's these ones that were out over the open ocean that we're concerned. So what we did was, this is work that Gabe Vecchi and I did a number of years ago, which we since refined and so forth. But you basically you take this, and we know we know what the ship tracks were like in the pre-satellite era. We actually have a record of how many ships there were crossing the Atlantic basin each year, and what time of the year they were crossing. So we have these observed ship tracks. That's part of our climate record. So what we did was we take these past ship tracks for various years, and then we assume that some modern era storm would have actually occurred back in some pre-satellite era year. And then we see how many times that sort of modern era storm would have encountered a ship close enough so that the ship would have observed it and measured its wind speeds. And it turns out that by our assessment, there weren't enough ships. The ship track density was just not high enough in the Atlantic to capture or to ever detect the storms, these modern era storms, if they had occurred back then. So we use that method to sort of make an estimate. Well, about how many storms then do we think we would have missed? And so we come up with a central estimate and a confidence interval. Really, it's an educated guess, but I think people who study this problem do acknowledge that, yes, our ability to see these things was definitely less back then. And how bad was it? How many do we think we missed? That's what we tried to get at with this study, using the ship track density and just pretending modern era storms would have occurred. And we play those modern era storms off against that time evolving ship track density, which changed over time when the Panama Canal opened and so forth. And we come up with these estimates year by year. That's how we come up with it. And I refer you to this website, Atlantic Hurricanes, Global Warming and Hurricanes website that links back to some of the original papers for more information.
Thank you so much, Tom. We are over time. Thank you all for joining us today. If we did get to your question, we will share that with Tom afterwards. Thank you all for coming. Thank you again, Tom. This was an excellent presentation. Thank you all and have a wonderful rest of your day.